Thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction, and also thank you once again, all of you, for that fantastic conference. I mean, I really learned a lot, and it's very, very difficult to do justice to this job with the final keynote, because one thing is, although I will speak about simultaneity later on, I cannot be simultaneously in more than one panel, so I didn't really see everything of the conference, but I tried to take as much impressions on board as I could. And at the same time, of course, this is not just a spontaneous reaction to what I heard, but I also prepared some thoughts on what I think, a research agenda on human rights and migration should entail. It's very much, of course, my personal research agenda, but I have the hope that it also overlaps with, to some extent, to hopefully a great extent, also with the MeDiMi and also the other research agendas in the room. So, and I'm very much looking forward to discuss that then with you. The thesis from which I start is that our way forward should be to focus on three interconnected dimensions of migration, and to do so from a comparative, human rights-based and interdisciplinary perspective. The three dimensions are the political economy of migration, the agency of migration, and the different modes of belonging. And I think to do so requires us first to understand critical features and dynamics of our current immigration societies, and I would say of the European immigration society. I will explain what I mean by that. And also, secondly, to examine the socio-economic power relations in the context of migration, to better understand and conceptualize migrants' agency from an interdisciplinary perspective, and to develop new interactive hybrid approaches to belonging that cater for the superdiversity that we are currently witnessing in the European immigration society. I will develop these four steps in turn, and I would like to start by describing the dynamic and features of the European immigration society. Max has already reminded us on the very first day of this conference, which already seems very long ago, at least to me, of the complex and also the dangerous tendencies of autocratization in the European immigration society. And he highlighted many of the attempts to undo human rights and reduce guarantees for migrants, although he ended on a more optimistic note. And I think over the last 3 days, we talked about a lot of different dimensions. We talked about the relationship between human rights and democracy. We talked about structural conditions of possibility for making human rights, for realizing human rights in very different forms in the immigration societies. We talked about claims making and rights making, to just mention a few things that I took away from the conference. And I'm today interested in the first step, interested in better understanding the formative features of that immigration society, because it's also part of the title of the conference. I looked it up again, in migration societies. And I deliberately choose to talk about the European immigration society as opposed to talking about domestic societies. The reason is that I think we have in the European Union, as you all know, we have a common European asylum system. We also have a lot of common migration policies. And also we have a common legal perspective in the treaties on the functioning of the European Union that explicitly, and for the lawyers amongst you, I will just once say where that is, in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. The Union itself speaks of it as a European society. So there is a normative claim that there is such thing as a European society, and I would claim that this is also a society, an immigration society, a society that is where one of the core features of which is immigration. And migration is also a topic that cuts across the national border. It dominates EU policies. It also dominates elections, both on the domestic and on the European level. So I really think it's justified to speak of a European immigration society. I focus on Europe because one of my research, my research mostly focuses on Europe, but I think many of the claims of about superdiversity as a feature of immigration societies that I will make in a minute also apply to other immigration societies. And I would also say that they also apply to many of the national or member state immigration societies in the European Union. Okay, so one of the core features, as I already hinted to, I think, is that it is a society that is characterized by superdiversity. Superdiversity is a concept that the anthropologist Steven Werteweg developed in 2007, initially with a view to the British Immigration Society. But just this year, Werteweg published a book on superdiversity where he explains that this concept further, he develops the concept further, he also traces the many usages that the concept has experienced over the last years, and he also explains why that is a concept that does not only apply to the British context. At its core, superdiversity describes a condition of contemporary societies that is characterized by diversification of global migration, so more and different migration drivers, proliferation of countries of origin, diversity of legal status that also result in a strong stratification of rights and also often in an increasing level of hierarchization and inequalities, but also demographic diversification. That includes forms of urban diversity, but also forms of diversity where old migration, so migration of people who have already settled, and new migration come together in different contexts, but also forms of new mixedness in the sense of identities, a fuzziness of language, and an unsettling and diversification also of other social categories such as gender and whatever you want to think of. So just to give you one example. Superdiversity describes a multiplicity, and here I quote, of processes simultaneously at work in shaping social patterns and structures, end of quote. But this happens at differing and variable speed, scale, and spread, and depending, of course, on the specific context. Crucially, superdiversity is not about a certain amount of diversity or an entire loss of sort of consensual social meanings and practices, but it's more an effect of the processes of diversification. So it can also happen in places with low diversity, where you have migration or where you have a sudden increase in diversity, let's frame it that way, or you have an increase in diversity in whatever form for the very first time. So it's not necessarily about the amount of diversity. Superdiversity is understood to be a form of social complexity, and social complexity, one can define it as a situation where the number of elements in a system increases and diversifies so that the modes of interdependence and also interaction also diversify as a result of. Diversification of migration meets a system that is also diversifying in other respects. And therefore, I think the social complexity in the European migration society is marked by a salience of difference and identity. So the categories of difference are socially constructed, but of course their effects are quite real. It's characterized by multiplicity, mixing, making and unmaking of social categories, so a certain destabilization of certainties and orthodoxies. And it is characterized after a period of more or less acceptance of diversity now by an increasing backlash against these forms of diversity that is generally marked by cultural essentialism, claims for unambiguousness of social categories, and simplification of social categories and relations. In the context of migration, this reaction to diversification is often also reduced to basically to the racial or ethno-racial dimension of migration. So migration has a lot of different social features, but this is a dimension that in the public discourse is very much in the forefront. And here again, I build on the work of Wertheweg. And it is also built on the assumption, the reactions are also built on the assumption that diversification is something that lowers trust and social cohesion in a society, which is why we would need something like groupism or culturalization and unambiguous forms of affiliation and belonging. I think that while we are witnessing, of course, that type of reaction, I think that what is often forgotten is that also other factors, in particular economic deprivation, social inequality, are factors that affect the distrust in public institutions much stronger and have a stronger bearing also on social cohesion than any of the other things that are publicly that are publicly portrayed as contributing to that. And I think in that sense, I think that we should really, and that's one thing I will do in the next step, we should really refocus also our attention to other dimensions of migration that relate more to that question of inequality. Okay, back to the European Immigration Society. Against the background of Wertheweg's concept, superdiversity, I argue that many national immigration societies in the European Union and beyond display this feature of superdiversity, either in the form of a lot of diversity or in the sense of new or quicker diversity, whatever we might witness. And I would say that the European society displays it in a very peculiar form. First of all, because it combines internal and external migration, but with different statuses, obviously. It also has a diversified form of status of citizenship, a form of graded citizenship. And it explicitly rules out the dominance of one language or one culture, but it only does so, obviously, for internal purposes. So external languages are treated differently, but nevertheless, that's, I think, an important feature. And it provides a single constitutional framework that is committed to human rights, non-discrimination, and solidarity. While I would not deny that the European Union policies very often don't live up to that, I think it's nevertheless important to bear that in mind. And I claim that we should understand the European society as a complex and super diverse society of immigration. We should focus our research on better understanding the dynamics of diversification, the position of migrants in these dynamics, and the normative implications for future policies of migration, integration, and citizenship. I think we can only do that in an interdisciplinary way, and I think much of what I will say now, it will become obvious that these are approaches where I already work with insights from other disciplines, but I hope that I can also try to explain a little bit where in the future research these different disciplines can come together. So the first point on the agenda for the super diverse migration societies that I would like to explain further is the political economy of migration. So it stresses the intersectional dimension of superdiversity, as I will explain in the course of my keynote. The basic assumption of the law and political economy approach more generally is that law allocates resources, such as power, money, status. It allocates resources to realize human aspirations or human projects. And the question then always is, how does the law structure and shape power relation, and how do, on the other hand, in particular economic power relations, impact the law and structure the law? To grasp that insight, of course, it is necessary to combine disciplines. While the law is necessary to understand, well, to get the knowledge about what the law actually says and to understand these specificities, then we, of course, in order to assess the effects of the law, the distributive effects of the law, economic theory, sociology, political theory come into play as well, just to name a few. So legal scholars alone cannot do the job, which is why I think that the interdisciplinary approach also at this conference is very important and in the whole project, and which is also why I learned a lot at this conference, in particular in those panels that were run not by lawyers but by others. In a conceptual article in the Yale Law Journal on law and political economy, Jedediah, Britton, Prudy, and others, it's a very huge group of authors, so I will just stick with and others, have identified 3 crucial shifts in the perspective that would allow us to better understand the distributive function of the law. All 3 come with distinct research questions, which I would like to specify for the context of migration law. The first shift is from efficiency to power. So the question is should no longer so much be how can the law be more efficient, in whatever sense we might define efficiency, but rather to ask, how does the law relate to power structures? So the first question to ask here would be, and I will in the next few minutes, I will ask a lot of questions rather than giving answers, because it's a research agenda, so it's open for the future to answer the questions. But I think it's very important, first of all, to ask how economic power and social status impact processes of migration. So the question would be, which migrants can actually influence their chances to get access? So what role does wealth play, for instance, when you think about golden visas or investment citizenship? What role does education play? Do skills play? What role does family play or property play? So in what way can migrants themselves, through influencing these different statuses or these different resources, influence their chances to get access and to migrate? So that would be the first question. And of course, human rights, I think, in that respect is a very important, play a very important role, because the question that we should ask here is whether human rights and to what extent they can alter the power relations between the state and the migrant. And we should also be careful to include the question whether they preserve the status quo or whether they continue to contribute to changing the power relations involved. And also I believe that that human rights can perform both roles, both functions. But the interesting question, of course, is what are, in the language of the MeDiMi project, the conditions of possibility under which human rights can contribute to changing these power relations. More generally speaking, in that context, I would say that human rights can always become an instrument of transformation, but they can also advocate for maintaining the status quo. So when you think of a right that is not directly related to migration, such as property, it's quite obvious that human rights can also have a conservative or conserving function in that sense. So we think to better understand the conditions under which human rights can become a force of transformation, and also to identify perhaps the limits. So is there an end where human rights do no longer cater for transformation and where we have to ask other questions or use other tools? I think that's important too in our future research. I also think that it's important to ask the question of how migration practices affect the power relations between home and host states, and also the power relations so across the different states, so between the states. I learned, for example, during this conference that lawful, in the panel on health and work that Michael and I attended together yesterday, that lawful behavior can also be a competitive disadvantage in the context of health care, but also in the context of labor migrants' rights. And I think that's an important dimension here, to also see how modes of competition that are not directly in the law, nevertheless play out in the context of migration law, and in particular also in the field of rights of labor migrants in that case. And by the same token, I also think it's important to ask the question how the increasing interaction between the state and private actors affects the power of migrants and also affects the possibilities of migrants to realize their human rights in different contexts. So here again, I think there are a lot of power shifts ongoing. And finally, in that field, I think it's important to, or in that respect, I think it's important to ask, how do economic power and social status also affect the integration of migrants, if you want to continue to use that term? I haven't come up with a better one. And how does migration law produce and reproduce social status also after arrival? So not only in the process of migration, but also after arrival. I think that is quite important. And I also think that it is interesting also to see how the law in different contexts tries to tries to frame also migration issues in a certain way. So one of the things in the context of labor migration that I also learned yesterday was that that trafficking is sort of a strategy to react to the exploitation of or the framing of trafficking is a way to react to the exploitation of migrants in the labor context. And I found that quite interesting, that although we could say, well, we have human rights and we could try to use them in order to combat violations in the context or exploitation in the context of labor migration, rather than doing that, one of the strategies seems to be, well, instead we're talking about trafficking, because that way we have an entirely different framing in which the empowerment of migrants actually doesn't play a role, but they are rather victimized, and also the entire thing is then also delegated to criminal law. I think that's also an important aspect to think about how the rights that migrants have once they arrived, how that relates also to other legal fields and framings. Okay, so that was the longest shift. The second shift I want that is part of that law and economy approach is a shift from neutrality to equality. So the question here is, or the assumption is, that the law, obviously, as we all share, is not neutral, but that it also contributes to inequalities, and that we should focus more on that issue of, or that matters of equality and inequality. One of the questions we should ask ourselves here is that we should question the narrative of labor market needs and instead rather speak of labor market demands. We should also question the assumption that markets automatically allow for fair access to resources like housing, like jobs, like education. So I think in that respect, it's important to bring also the issue of anti-discrimination clauses in human rights law closer to classic migration law, and to acknowledge that freedom in that respect is always a socially conditioned form of freedom. I think it's also important to ask how migration law creates, maintains, and reinforces inequality and subordination that is based on other social categories. And I think in line with the insights from superdiversity, we should ask how, for instance, the residence status intersects with other categories like age, like gender, like ethnicity, like religion, and of course, what role human rights can play in achieving more egalitarian forms of equality. And the third shift is from anti-politics to democracy, and ask basically, who should exercise power, of what sort, and over whom? So here I think we should move from from an only individualistic picture of democracy and participation to one that also includes collective modes of exercising power, and that is in our context also of exercising human rights. And I think we have done that in a lot of have seen that in a lot of panels over the last 2 days. And I found it quite interesting in that respect in the first panel this morning that Andrea also stressed the impairment of collectivism and solidarity that can be created through the ways in which migrants are forced to interact with the law and are forced to stress their singularity in order to be protected, and what that actually does also in terms of collective empowerment and collective participation. Okay, I think I will stop here with regard to the three shifts. The questions that I have asked so far are mostly empirical, but I think that the political economy of migration approach that I suggest also has a normative agenda that is involved. And the first aspect of that normative agenda is that we should transnationalize the debate about economic power or about power through and in migration law. I think that we should acknowledge more that migration really takes place in transnationalized or transnational contexts of exploitation and of also subordination. And that, of course, means that we should decenter the nation state in migration law and focus more on the interactions between, on the one hand, between migrants, but also interactions between or across, not between, but across the member states. That's what I wanted to say. So I think that's a very important part. We should also think about whether some of the discourses that are very connected at the moment, like migration and development, we should look closer into discourses like that and ask ourselves in how far it is actually a useful thing to do that, and what forms of exploitation or subordination are also transported then in discourses like that, or to phrase it differently, to make it more visible that economic structures, of course, play a role here. Second, we should develop a meaningful and more egalitarian concept of equality that includes a transnational perspective and that caters for the complexity of our societies. And third, in particular in the context of labor migration, I think we should ask in how far migration can be understood as a form of economic pursuit of happiness, or whether that could be a normative perspective that we could agree upon. And I think in that sense, it could be understood also as a practice, or we should ask ourselves whether it's possible to understand it on the individual level as a practice that helps mitigating forms of broader forms of structural exploitation, or whether this is a completely unrealistic and too individualistic take on the topic. You decide. And finally, I think we should understand and theorize the relationship between the individual human rights and the structural power conditions in the context of migration. And that brings me to the second dimension I would like to address: migrants' agency. I think acknowledging the structural dimension of economic power for migration processes should not lead us to the conclusion that migrants are just objects of a larger structure, or that even less so that they are even less so support the broader image of migrants as victims or something like that. It would be easy to fall in that trap and to say, well, it's all just, let's say, an expression of global capitalism, and if we want to solve the problem, we have to solve that problem. So that should not be the conclusion of what I said in the first part of the keynote. The story should not end here. Rather, I think we should acknowledge, and that is something we have done a lot over the last days, how and understand how migrants use, modify, exploit, circumvent, shape structures through their interaction with these instruments, how they shape the law, but also other defining structures, and in particular how they use human rights to modify barriers, to modify structures otherwise created by the law. Following the work of, I hope I pronounce her name correctly, it's difficult, it's Scottish and I don't speak that, Cheta Manwaring, I suggest to begin the analysis of power that I just advocated for from the everyday lived experiences of migrants. Agency is a concept that has as of yet been rather rarely theorized in migration studies, so there's a lot of talk about autonomy of migration, and in a recent work, the sociologist Hein de Haas has suggested to interpret the relation between agency and structure as an interaction of migrants' aspirations on the one hand and capabilities on the other hand. But the goal of most of these studies, also, for instance, the research on transnational network approaches that stress that migration is operating in networks and not so much on an individualized basis, the goal of all these approaches is more to establish causalities in the sense of what drives migration. And so it's less about the question of what is actually the role of migrants in doing all that. What is their own agency, right? So I think I found the approach of Mainwaring very intriguing. She has conducted an empirical research of how migrants try to cross the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe, and how they use and shape the law for their purposes. So how they continue to do so, more importantly, during the process of arrival and after arrival as well. She builds on a lot of other authors who have stressed that we should not think of the decisions of migrants in the sense of rational choice, but rather in a spirit of understanding decision-making, understanding opportunity structures, room for maneuver that the law may create. And crucially, she extended that approach also beyond the mere decision to migrate and the realization of migration, so the process of access, but also to the later stages of migration. And I would strongly support that we should think about agency in the whole, let's say, in the whole process of a migration career from the very beginning to the end. Following Emirbai and Anuscheh, Mainwaring conceptualizes agency as, I quote, temporarily embedded engagement by actors of different contexts, which through interplay of habit, imagination, judgment, reproduce and transform those structures. So any strategical use of the law expresses a sort of agency. What does that now entail for us as migration scholars? I think on an empirical level, we should move to micro-studies and combine them also with macro-studies. So I think we should combine ethnography, sociology, psychology, and the law, and to do that both methodologically speaking, qualitatively and quantitatively. And I think we should think those things more together rather than in very, very separate and distinct silos. I think we should ask how migrants interact with the law, how they use it, how they modify it also, and in particular, how they use and invoke and claim rights in different contexts. So not only in the law or in politics, but also in culture and everyday life, just as we have also witnessed that here, and also I think what is one of the goals that MeDiMi tries to achieve. So when do they frame their claims as human rights claims, and when do they perceive human rights as a tool of agency, and when do they not? I think that question is equally important, and I would like to stress that. So, and I think it's also important then to ask, what does it do with the self-perception of migrants and their perceived agency if they use human rights, or if they use law, other parts of the law, in order to realize their aspirations. I think there are many examples. One that is closer to my research field would be, for instance, how migrants negotiate skills, how they use different statuses for instance, the status as a student, also to pursue, also to achieve other purposes. That is rarely framed in the language of human rights, but I think it's interesting to go more into detail here, and also to dig deeper and to understand whether human rights play a role in these processes as well. We should also ask how migrants interact with others to strategically use the law in strategic litigation, in litigation networks and grassroots movements, whether they use intermediaries to facilitate migration in the context of labor migration, very often agencies, but we might also think of other types of intermediaries. And we should look closer at local practices of inclusion through cultural projects, art, and other forms of empowerment that not necessarily cross our mind immediately when we think about human rights. So I think it's very important to go deeper into that claiming and making of rights, and understanding what it actually means also for the subjectivity, for rights subjectivity, to quote from one of the panels that I attended yesterday. And I think it's also relevant here to think about a transdisciplinary approach in a sense that it includes also collaborative and participatory research. I know that has a lot of difficulties, but I think it's very, very important to bring that also into the picture, and this conference has also, in part, also done that, to understand really the many ways in which rights are articulated in practice and by whom they are articulated, and to get a much better knowledge about the conditions under which that actually happens, and how the dynamics of rights claiming actually function. I think we should also ask how strategic uses of the law affect the individual status, but also how they affect and whether they affect collective empowerment of migrants. That is, to what extent this has a bearing on the broader structures that I mentioned and discussed in the first part of my keynote. And finally, I think we should ask how structures of the law may limit or enable or even invite that form of agency, in particular through human rights. And I think on a normative level, we should try to really theorize the concept of migrant agency further, with a specific view to the role of the law and the role of human rights therein. The final dimension I would like to mention is the different modes of belonging in the context of superdiversity. The insights of superdiversity that I mentioned in the beginning of this keynote, together with the insights on law and political economy and the focus on agency, I think lead to this last dimension that I think really requires more attention, namely the changing modes of belonging and the changing forms of belonging that we are witnessing. The conditions, or the condition of superdiversity, fundamentally, I think, changes the ways how and to which entities people develop ties, develop feelings of belonging. And I deliberately here speak of people in the sense of the entire society. And I think the insight that migrants shape the acknowledgement, insight is I think wrongly phrased, but the acknowledgement that migrants also shape their own fate as much as it is also structured by the law and by structures that they cannot really access immediately, allows us to see that migrants are not a coherent group, but rather to see them as actors in a web of relationship and interactions that shape their senses of belonging, and most importantly, to see them as members of our immigration society. I think that's quite important, however disenfranchised they may be, to really shift that view when we talk about modes of belonging. I think that's quite important. On an empirical level, I think this requires us to explore and analyze how migrants perceive belonging in the context of superdiverse societies, what the relevant entities are, and what the hierarchy between them maybe also is, to understand which role the structure in the form of state action, encounters with administration, social infrastructure, legal prospects of immigration status, and so on and so forth, plays in the development of senses of belonging. So to think again about the structural power of law also in that context of belonging. And I think we should gain knowledge about how migrants actively shape their belonging and how they act strategically and under which conditions to achieve full membership or not in the host societies. And at the same time, I think what is quite important is also to turn the question around and to understand how does migration also changes the modes of belonging of those who are already here, whether they have been migrants themselves in the past or not, whether they are citizens or not. But I think that's quite important to view both sides in that respect. I think we should also analyze when these claims for belonging are framed as human rights frames, and how rights condition also the modes of participation and interaction. And also to acknowledge more that modes of belonging is not something that has only to do with the societies in which a migrant lives at the moment, but is rather something that has a very transnational dimension, in the sense that obviously they are very often continuous ties to also the countries from where they are coming. On a normative level, I think that it's very important that we theorize simultaneity in migration processes and in migrant senses of belonging. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there are a lot of migrants that move back and forth between their country of origin and the country that they are living in. I think it's very important to also acknowledge that they maintain ties in more than one country, and this is becoming rather the norm than the exception, and to also think about how that affects our ideas, our normative thinking about modes of belonging and membership. I think we should conceptualize hybridity and complexity as conditions of the development and transformation of our societies of immigration under the condition of superdiversity. So we should question narratives and images of unambiguousness and of belonging and of unidirectional processes of migration. We should challenge the essentialization of cultures and also both in the host state but also in migrant communities. And we should develop alternative models of fluid and hybrid forms of belonging. We should develop also new modes and models of participation, representation, and interaction. So I think we should develop an interactive understanding of what integration could mean that requires adaptation both from those who are already here and those who are newcomers. I think that's quite important, and we should do so by, on the one hand, reflecting the messiness of superdiversity without reproducing the categories, the social categories of difference. That would, again, include decentering the nation state, looking in the black box, but also opening the horizon for new forms of belonging beyond the nation state. And it would also require acknowledging that migration changes the host societies, but that the creation of a new society of immigration requires interaction, as I already said, between migrants and citizens, and that only if we achieve that and if we really internalize that, we can have a really conscious process of shaping our society's future. I think, coming back to my initial idea of the European immigration society, that at least on a normative level, we should be well equipped in the sense that we already have the call for a human rights-based approach also on a normative level. We have a call for solidarity and non-discrimination, as I said in the beginning, but I think we should look deeper also to the more general infrastructures that such a vision of interactive, integrative societies or inclusive societies would require. So I think it's very important to include, for instance, also the rights of NGOs in that, and of civil society in that respect, and how they contribute to that process of interaction. I think we should also talk more about what the common infrastructure of immigration societies, and acknowledge that this is a common good in which we as a society have to invest. And I mean investment here really in that economic sense. I think that it is quite important also to link these questions, again, of economic costs or power and of infrastructural dimensions with the questions about inclusion and belonging. I think that is really important to make, in that sense, the immigration society really a common endeavor to pursue. Okay, I come to my conclusion. I have started with the condition of superdiversity and stressed the relevance of power and also of wealth in the context of migration. I've called for the agency of migrants as a decisive factor that we need to better understand. And finally, I talked about belonging as a feeling, as a status of affiliation that reflects simultaneity, hybridity, and complexity. And finally, I said frequently, I think in all three dimensions, that we should decenter the nation state in migration studies. So we should go transnational, but also subnational, and also focus on the practices in cities. I think that's also a very important aspect. Maybe one of the aspects. I mean, we had that about Amsterdam yesterday, but that was not so much present during the conference. I think in all this, human rights play a crucial, yet an ambiguous role. They often allow to change established structures and to initiate transformation or to claim participation. They are important in enabling structural change, but at the same time, their formal nature sometimes also limits what is possible and seems, at least, to serve to preserving the status quo. At the same time, we have seen many instances over the last 2 days where claims for human rights transgress these perceived limits of human rights and allow us to develop more utopian understandings of the law for the future. And I think it's this way in which we should, it's this avenue that we should explore further and that we should follow further and try to understand how that actually also happens and under which conditions such a utopian or transformative potential can be realized. But I also think that we should pay attention to the ambiguity that I just mentioned. Lastly, I would like to come back to a thing that Max mentioned in his keynote on the first day of this conference, where he talked about, I think it was a quote by Baumann, where he said, one of the backlash or elements of backlash is that the future is only imagined as a site of nightmares. And I thought to myself that I think sometimes we share a more progressive understanding should be careful not to also fall in that trap. If we just envision the future in the form of doomsdaying, then I think we fall into the trap and ourselves produce an image of the future as a site of nightmare. I think we have an obligation to optimism and to broaden the perspective on transformation, on global justice, on transnationalization, and on even individual and collective agency in the context of migration processes. And I would like to end with a quote by Viktor Frankl that I find at least quite hopeful. I quote, "I speak of tragic optimism, that is, an optimism in the face of tragedy and in view of the human potential, which, at its best, always allows for turning suffering into human achievement and accomplishment, deriving from guilt the opportunity to change oneself for the better, and deriving from life's transitoriness an incentive to take responsible action." Thank you.